Welcome to the Big Séance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the Séance. Welcome back. Thank you for returning for another episode of the Big Séance podcast. It was last week that I announced that as of now, I'll be releasing episodes every other week instead of weekly. And so thank you for your patience and for obviously showing back up for this episode. And actually, I usually release my episodes on Thursdays, but because I wanted to give you something to enjoy for your holiday travel, if you're here in the US, I decided to get this one out a few days early. I know I love getting caught up on my podcasts when I'm heading out of town in my car. So I hope my fellow Americans have a great and happy Thanksgiving. I know I'm looking forward to it. Now let's get to today's content. Don't forget that as you're listening, you can always check out BigSeance.com for show notes. You know, when I set out to create the Big Séance podcast, I knew that quite a bit of the content would come from the books that I read and the fascinating people and bloggers that I follow. Today's guest is one of those people that I've been following for quite a while. Okay, now, Tim Prasil, today's guest, is a man of many talents, which I'd love to talk about, but there's a fascinating story that you must hear about first and check out. I don't think that there's a writer in the world who is doing what Tim is doing. So, okay, just listen. Tim is a descendant of Lyda Prasilova, also known as Lucille Prasil. Lyda assisted with the supernatural investigations of Vera Van Slyke, born in 1868, died in 1941, and she chronicled their cases. So Vera was one of the earliest paranormal investigators, if I understand that correctly. Tim inherited those chronicles, and very soon his book, Help for the Haunted, A Decade of Vera Van Slyke Mysteries, with all of those stories, will be available to the public. So that is the really cool topic we're going to talk about today. Welcome, Tim. How are you, sir?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Oh, I'm excited to chat with you. So here's my first question.
Yeah.
I can definitely tell you that as a giant paranerd, and my listeners know this, if I were in your shoes and I found out about this treasure of manuscripts from one of my descendants, I think that I would have just been, well, I would have completely nerded out and I'd be in paranormal heaven, which is a weird phrase to use now that I think about it. But were you interested in the paranormal before you learned about all of this, or is it what got it all started for you?
I was leaning that direction, I think. I was starting to write fiction, write stories, and I did speculative fiction, which is sort of a general umbrella term for science fiction, horror, you name it. Fantasy would probably fit in there too. So I was dabbling around with that, and I was always a fan of things like novels like Dracula and Frankenstein. My grandmother, here's an interesting story about inheriting those stories. My grandmother found out that I liked the ghostly stuff and science fiction and things like that. And she mentioned that I had an ancestor who chronicled these adventures that she had with Vera Van Slyke, not Van Slyke. But
I'm sorry. I was trying to be fancy.
Yeah. And I, my jaw hit the floor, and I said, I need to find these things. And she went up into her attic and couldn't find them. So I was horribly disappointed for years. Then my father passed away a few years ago, and going through his things, he had, boxes of fishing tackle and you name it. He was an architect, and he had pencils, just boxes of pencils and drawings and things like that. Among all of those belongings was what had originally been used to display seed packets in a store. But it was this kind of interesting collapsible wooden box from probably the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, but that general period. And we're going through this stuff. I had long since forgotten about these stories that my grandmother had mentioned and couldn't find. But I opened it up, and sure enough, there were some very sloppy, I will say, manuscripts in disarray, and I immediately recognized them. Oh, those are the manuscripts that my grandmother told me probably 20, 25 years earlier. So that's how I came across them. And once again, my jaw hit the floor. Here they are.
Wow. That must have been an exciting moment.
It was surreal.
So it was just a fairly recent thing that you got a hold of these.
Yeah, I would say probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And, I'm trying to whip them into shape. It's a tricky thing being an editor, because on the one hand, I feel very much like a co-writer with Emby Press, my great-grandaunt. But, I work hard to try to keep the accuracy, keep them the way they are as much as possible. But there are times when, people writing in the early 1900s just had a different sensibility about ethnicity and race. And there are a few things that I alter. I'll make them a little bit softer. But I let most of it go right through. I figure that's just my ancestor's personality coming through. So.
Yeah, and it's history.
Right.
Okay, so let's back up. Who was Vera Van Slyke?
She was a journalist, sort of from that period of crusading journalists, people like Ida Tarbell. There were a number of them. Upton Sinclair, who also wrote a lot of fiction, was one of these crusading journalists who tried to expose big city corruption or big business corruption. They were often on the side of the underdog, the working class people, and they used journalism to reform society. Vera Van Slyke was one of those reporters, but her specialty was exposing fake spiritualists, psychic mediums. She was a little bit like Houdini in that respect. Actually, she met Houdini at one point. One of the stories is about that. And possibly she was Houdini's inspiration. So that was her personal battle. She didn't believe that you could sit around a table and have someone go into a trance and call forth the spirits of the dearly departed. One of her lines is, because she was a big believer in ghosts. At the same time as she was defrauding spiritualist mediums, she was investigating ghosts and, according to my great-grandaunt, finding them. So she was an interesting character. She's got some contradictions there, but her way of explaining that contradiction of not believing that we could summon spirits, but believing that ghosts do intrude upon the physical realm, her line was, "Ghosts are like cats. They're real, but they don't come when you call them." I think that's a pretty nice way of explaining that contradiction.
I think so too. And I think there are many of us in, this paranormal craze right now that kind of have the same kind of conflicted, we completely believe in it, but yet, have a skeptic view about a lot of it.
Which I think is very healthy. That's sort of my attitude. Is I'm cautious about things. I don't want to be overly eager to believe, and yet I don't want to discount anything either. If there is something out there, let's explore it. Let's find out.
Every time I think of Vera, it just reminds me of Harry Price, who was a psychic researcher or paranormal investigator, basically, from about the same time period. And I love his book. I've only read one of them, The Most Haunted House in England. I've always been fascinated by his early techniques for investigating these types of things. Do you know if there was ever a connection with Vera and Harry?
That I haven't seen that name in the manuscripts that I've gotten. I mentioned Houdini there. That's probably the biggest name. But that's an interesting thing that you bring up, because Harry Price, as I understand it, like many psychic investigators being published at that time, were sort of known to stretch the truth, if not create it altogether. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I have to think about with these manuscripts, is how much of this is my ancestor actually recording things? How much is she tweaking things? Is she making things up? I do know that occasionally she will change the name of a town, for instance. There's one of the stories is set in Tadcaster, Massachusetts. I now have the power of the internet to find out if, in fact, there is a place called Tadcaster, Massachusetts, and there isn't. But I think in that case, she was protecting the identity of a church. There was a ghost in a church, and she didn't want to, cause that church to have a bad reputation. And so she just changed the name. That was fairly common back then, particularly earlier in the 1800s. You'll see things like a character that's just designated by an initial and then a dash. That was it's complicated because it was presented as a way to protect the identity of the real person. But then fiction writers would use that as a trick to suggest that perhaps this piece of fiction isn't really fiction at all. So, but at the same time, I have done research and obscure characters. There's one character, let me see if I can remember his name. Henry Thorne Lord, I believe his name is. He was an old sea captain. Or at least that's the name that my great-granddad used. Once again, I have the power of the internet. I can do amazing research. I found that this person existed, and I found him in a newspaper in Australia. He was a victim of a mutiny, and it changed his life, and later became part of his haunting. The ghosts that followed him through life. But she used his real name, apparently, and that's something that she couldn't have. Well, I suppose she could have heard it from somebody, and then wrote a story about it. But it seems like a stretch. I don't know how she would have known this actual historical figure's name in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I can find it out because, like I say, I've got the power of the internet. I can do amazing things. So there she used the actual name of a historical figure. There's a later tale where that's set in Chicago, and she uses the coroner's name. I'm going to blank on his name, but it's the actual guy. You can find him on the internet. So sometimes she uses historical figures' names. Sometimes she changes names. I'm not sure how to interpret this. Is she making up stories? Is she telling the truth? Is it a little bit of both? And so I'm just going to present them to the world with that in mind. You figure it out.
So what have you gathered from your family about what the goal was of these manuscripts when they were being written? Do you know any of that information?
Yes, I do. That's actually explained in the book. There's a foreword and an afterword that sort of explain that. And I'm wondering how much I should give away because, of course, I want to sell the book. But,
of course.
But I will say this. My great-grandaunt she got married. And while she was courting her future husband, he went away for a while. He went to Alaska to find his money. That was the thing to do in the early 1900s. And they kept in touch by letter. And she would she would tell him these stories, these adventures that she would have with this amazing Vera Van Slyke. And he loved them. He loved hearing these stories. So at one point, World War II got here. So we're now in the late, 1916, 1917. So he went off to war. And I guess, this is a little bit of guesswork here, but it looks like in order to continue to feel close to her husband while he's off fighting in France, she started writing these things down in a very formal way. It looks almost as if they were intended for publication, but they never got published. Lyda, my great-grandaunt, was very much a reader. So she had sort of a literary bent. And like I say, it feels like some of these stories were intended for magazine publication, maybe book publication, but they were really just her writing down her memories of being with Vera Van Slyke for her husband who was off at war. And why they never went there, maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's kind of a sad tale. I'll just say he never came back from war. So she threw them in a box, a handy box, closed it, and there they sat.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And this collection's coming out at the end of the year, right?
Hopefully before the end of the year. We're not really sure what the date will be. We're working on the cover art right now, but hopefully in another month or two.
So are there any cases that will be published in the future?
Yes. Among those manuscripts, there was one narrative that was long enough for a book. So that's, the Help for the Haunted is 13 sort of short story length chronicles. There's one more that actually involves the Morley Mansion, which is outside of Boston. There was a millionaire named Roderick Morley who's got his money from tobacco, inherited all this money and became very interested in the occult. He held a seance. Oh, I didn't even mention this, did I? That Lyda Prasilova was a psychic medium, and a fake one. She opens up. She's very candid about it, that she was fooling people. And it actually cost her a fair amount of guilt. But she was hired for this millionaire's seance. It's a complicated story. I won't get into it because it'll take forever. But sure enough, one of the people attending the seance was Vera Van Slyke. There is this person who goes around exposing phony mediums, and that's how she met Vera Van Slyke. However, because Lyda wanted to get out of the business, she was very happy to hear that Vera was working on a book about the tricks of spiritualist mediums, and very willingly agreed to be interviewed by Vera Van Slyke for this book. But on their very first interview, Vera approached Lyda and said, "Hey, I've heard about this haunted church. Do you want to join me?" And, of course, Lyda was, "Wait a second, you expose mediums, but you believe in ghosts." So she went on the adventure. They found a ghost. And within a year, Lyda was working for Vera Van Slyke. About 4 years later, after that first meeting at the Morley Mansion, the Morley Mansion had ghosts. So they were invited back to investigate the ghosts. And that narrative is a long one, long and complicated. So what I decided to do was to make Help for the Haunted. That's 13 short stories, short story length chronicles. And then put the 1899 meeting of Lyda and Vera into the same book as the story of them going back to the Morley Mansion. So the setting is cohesive. It all takes place at the Morley Mansion. But you get the story of what happened when Vera and Lyda first met, and then 4 years later, when they returned to the very same place that they first met to investigate ghosts. And it's enough to fill up a book. So I thought that would be a nice way to do that. I'm working on that manuscript now. That one's tentatively titled "Guilt is a Ghost." So that would be the one to watch for in the future.
Oh, and I will be. What do you think your great-grandaunt or Vera would think about this current paranormal craze that we're in now in our culture? It's very much like a new spiritual movement in a way, isn't it?
It is. I suspect that Vera particularly would look at it with some caution, in the same way that she looked at spiritualism, that late 1800s, early 1900s, big swell of interest in spiritualism. She looked at that with some caution, but at the same time, I bet she would be utterly delighted by it because she was fascinated by the supernatural. She had definite views on what is real and what isn't real, but she was, I think, throughout her life, just utterly fascinated by it. She'd
be busy, that's for sure.
Yes. If not debunking people, then confirming. Yeah, she would probably have her own cable TV show, and
she'd be on Sci-Fi or the Travel Channel.
Exactly.
So, though you acted as an editor with your great-grandaunt's manuscripts, you have also done some writing, correct?
Correct. Yeah, mostly audio dramas. I did a series called Marvelous Boxes a few years ago. It was produced by the Dakota Ring Theater, which is a very well-respected group of actors up in Toronto, Ontario, who get together every once in a while and they record essentially radio dramas, but for the internet age, so we call them audio dramas now since they're not put on the radio.
I think that's fascinating that there's a group that still does that. That is awesome.
Yeah. There are actually quite a few. The internet has been sort of a boon to audio drama. It brought it back. There's a lot of really bad stuff out there, but it's a lot of it is amateur, just people who love doing it and having a blast doing it. And they put it up on the internet, so it's surprising. But if you come to my website, the Tim Prasil website, or blog site, I guess we should call it, I have a list of those plays and the other pieces of writing that I've done. They're available for free. They're on the internet. You can download them, put them in your iPod, listen to them whenever you want.
Who is Finbar Kelly?
Finbar Kelly is a guy I met in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was very much a character. Every Friday, I would see him at a particular bar. I was working on my PhD in English in the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I figured I was working pretty hard. Friday night, I need to go out, have myself a beer. There was always this sort of quiet gentleman, oddly dressed, down at the end of the bar. He would occasionally glance up and, look at what was going on. He'd have a notebook. And every once in a while, he would have enough beer so that he would become more friendly, and he would say the craziest things. I mean, they were very funny, very witty, sometimes just very poetic. I once asked him what he works on in his notepad, and he says, "Oh, I write limericks." He had barest hint of an Irish accent. He was born and raised in the States, but I think his parents were from Ireland. And so you could almost hear, just a wee bit of an Irish accent to it. I exaggerated it there, but so he was just this fascinating guy, and it didn't occur to me at the time to write down some of the funny things that he would say or the witty things that he would say. But every once in a while, I think back and I remember one of these little tipsy quips, I call them. And he would occasionally read his limericks, which were not that good, but they were charming. And so now what I'm doing is I'm trying to remember them. And every Friday, in honor of going to the bar and seeing him on all those Fridays, every Friday I try to recall one and post it on my blog. And if I can remember the limericks, those are harder to remember, but every once in a while, so I might be tinkering with them a little bit, just because of my faulty memory. But I post them, try to post one every Friday.
Well, that's cool to hear. I've always wondered,
Yeah.
When I see them, I'm like, what is this Finbar Kelly stuff about?
Yep, that's the story. I'm hoping if I can remember enough of them, maybe I can get a book out of it.
Maybe.
It's just like a joke in poetry book or joke in limericks. I'm calling it the Tipsy Quips and Rickety Limericks of Finbar Kelly as remembered by Tim Prasil. That's the title. It's fairly long.
Now, speaking of your writing, and I had to stop and mention that in my Halloween Memories and Tradition episode, I should say, from October 29th, Tim very graciously offered his talent to very quickly write up a fun little script for a witch friend of mine to read at the beginning of that episode. And it was great. And I want to thank you publicly for doing that for us.
You're very welcome. That was a lot of fun.
I'm glad I asked you because I couldn't believe how quickly you turned that around. And I was like, shut up. This is funny.
Well, it was a great writer's exercise and a challenge. And I had a bunch of other things that I should have done. But it's one of those things where you've got so much that you need to do that you really just look for something else to do just to get away from it. And that came along at the perfect moment. But what an interesting challenge, right? Halloween memories from the point of view of a witch. I couldn't say no to that.
Creative exercise for an educator.
Yeah. I might use that if I ever teach creative writing or something like that. I'll have that handy. Say, okay, now you're all witches and remembering Halloween. Go.
So let's talk about your blog for a bit, since we mentioned that. What else might one find there?
A couple of things. Actually, because of Vera, I have become very interested in nonfiction about ghosts from the 19th century, from the 1800s. And I actually get a little bit into the early 1900s. But I've been finding an awful lot of this stuff on the web. So I created a bibliography. I call it Ghost or No Ghost, 19th Century Nonfiction About Ghosts. And I provide all kinds of links to very serious discussions about, are ghosts real? Are they not real? Are they delusions? There are also a few collections of purportedly true ghost stories. You always have to wonder about those because I've inherited these purportedly true ghost stories, and I don't know if they're actually true or not, but they sure are interesting. So that's one bibliography then that I have. I also have a bibliography of fictional characters that are very like Vera Van Slyke. They investigate the occult. I have a PhD in English in literature, and so I am fascinated by all of these things. I've managed to trace the occult detective in fiction back to, I believe it's 1817, which is much earlier than a lot of people thought it went back to. But the conventional story is that the occult detective begins with Sheraton Le Fanu's Dr. Martin Hesselius in 1869. First of all, I traced it back earlier to that, and here's a very interesting coincidence. In 1855, a writer named James O'Brien published a story called The Pot of Tulips, and it features a character named Harry Escott. Harry Escott reappeared in another James O'Brien story about 4 years later called What Was It? A Mystery. Here's a funny thing. In the Vera Van Slyke Chronicles, Vera refers to her mentor in ghost hunting, and it's a man named Harry Escott. And she refers to these two stories and says that James O'Brien wasn't writing fiction. He was just chronicling stories that Harry Escott told him. So I connected with that personally. James O'Brien was trying to popularize these ghost hunter stories. Now I find myself in the same situation. And there seems to be a connection between Harry Escott and Vera Van Slyke. But I found I traced the occult detective figure back earlier. There's an entry for 1840, a horrible story. It's really just an awful story, but it does have a character in it who investigates the supernatural as he's investigating a murder. But then it goes back to at least as far as 1817 to E.T.A. Hoffman's short story. In English, it's called The Deserted House, and there's a figure there. There's a haunted character who takes his problems to a doctor known only as Dr. K. And the doctor does some research and some investigating and solves the mystery and the haunting.
So what did these investigators, how did they refer to themselves in those days? I mean, they wouldn't have used the term ghost hunter, would they?
Probably not. I don't know if they had a term for it. It's about the time that Vera Van Slyke appears in the late 1800s and early 1900s that you really get all kinds of them, in fiction, and they go by all kinds of different names. Trying to think of them. Sometimes they're called psychic detectives or psychical detectives, but I don't know that there was ever any one term that would apply to all of them. Even the term occult detective, not everybody uses that term. Some people call them psychic detectives. Although in my mind, that sort of suggests that they might be clairvoyant, and many of them are, but not all of them.
Yeah. I'll be right back with the rest of my interview with Tim Prasil.
You're listening to the Big Séance podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
Oh, look. We've got listener feedback. So I have some listener feedback today in the form of audio. My new friend, Karen, who has been an amazing supporter of the podcast, called the feedback line and left some more glowing feedback. And I don't get messages from the feedback line that often. I get really excited when I see it. That feedback line, by the way, is 7755-TELL-ME or 775-583-5563. Now, Karen has always had very kind and lovely things to say through the feedback line on social media and even iTunes, and I'd like to thank her publicly once again. Now, I don't want anyone to think that I'm full of myself, but I am very proud of the podcast, which has kind of been my baby this year. Before I share Karen's feedback, I want to remind you that you can also leave audio feedback using the SpeakPipe link that you can find at the top of the page at bigseance.com. You can also get to the same page by just going to speakpipe.com/bigseance, actually. And with that link, you can record audio feedback on just about any device. And your audio feedback doesn't have to be a glowing review, by the way. Feel free to ask a question, suggest a topic, give feedback about a guest, anything really. And I look forward to hearing from you.
Hey, Patrick, it's Karen. I just wanted to tell you that you have totally spoiled me for any other podcast. I've tried listening to others, and the sound is horrible. They talk about stuff that doesn't even matter. Plus, they usually have another person with them, and they go off on personal tangents about other things. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you, between you and Jim Harold, you guys have the best podcast on there, and I love listening to him, and I'm happy to hear some more. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Séance podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
Now, let's get back to my interview with Tim Prasil. So let's turn to hobbies. Don't we share an interest in visiting cemeteries and cemetery photography?
We do. In fact, I kind of wanted to talk to you about that because you do really interesting work in that. I just dabble, but you come up with art, masterpieces, and post them on the web. I just keep mine to myself. But yeah, what is it? What is it about us that makes us want to wander through old cemeteries with cameras?
Well, I don't know. I just, I've said in the past too, my grandmother that I spent quite a bit of time with growing up in kind of a small town in the middle of nowhere. She lived near a really old cemetery in the country. You know, back in those days, they would have tucked them away somewhere.
Right.
And I used to even sometimes by myself just hang out. And I remember my grandma even a couple of times packing a picnic lunch, and I would go hang out in the cemetery. And they've always been very, very peaceful to me. They were never, ever anything that was maybe a little bit, I guess when you're growing up, you think of them as spooky, and maybe there was that draw, but they've also always been like a park to me, I guess.
Yeah, a park with history lessons, because every name and the dates, you start to wonder, who was that person? What did they live? What was their life all about? What did they die of sometime? I'm very fortunate to be married to a woman who shares this strange interest. And we live in Oklahoma. I'm in Oklahoma now. We'll go driving, and for some reason, I don't know if this is a state law or what, but we always see these signs that says cemetery with an arrow. And we hardly ever go by one without immediately turning, and we have to go through old, dirty country roads, dusty, not dirty, but and we do find these very remote, overgrown cemeteries, and they're utterly fascinating. I mean, they're beautiful, but the stories, the untold stories, I think, is part of the fascination, the mysteries of who these people are. And we went to one on Memorial Day. There was a woman standing there with a clipboard, and she's talking to everybody who came by. Apparently, Memorial Day is a good day for going to the graveyard or collecting information. And she was trying to find out who was buried where, because there are a few very old gravestones that you just couldn't make out the names, and probably some graves that never had any headstones at all. But she started telling us about the history and about how, I think it's a flu epidemic. I don't think it was smallpox. It was a flu epidemic from around 1917, I want to say.
I'm going to let you go with that because I can't verify.
Yeah. I'm not, dates in my head. And there's so much going on at that time. There's all kinds of terrible things, really. But my wife asked her, why are there so many people who died in this one particular year? And so she was there to explain to us. But, so often there's not someone there to explain to you what is going on, why there were so many deaths in this particular year. And so it just becomes this really fascinating mystery. And I think that's part of the appeal. It's either, I don't know, help me out with this. Is it not knowing the stories, or is it speculating on the stories? Is it wondering, sort of filling in the gaps and using our imaginations to give life to these names?
Well, I think I've had kind of two little phases that I've gone through. Like, it used to be that, the question of who are these people and what were their stories, and just kind of a more of a spiritual experience in the cemetery. And then, the last 2 years, I just, I got a new camera, and I'm not a trained photographer, so I very much just experiment and just float around and, pretend like I know what I'm doing. But now sometimes I'll find that I'll spend, an hour or two, and I'm worried so much about the photography of it and the look of it and the beauty of it that I kind of don't as much think about those stories. And sometimes I feel bad. I'm like, oh, I should take a step back and actually, think more about the genealogy of this stuff. So I've kind of gone in waves.
Yeah, I understand. That reminds me of when I first started doing this. I was fairly young. I grew up in Illinois, and I found one of those very rural gravestones. And I was walking around with my camera, and I asked myself, is this respectful to the dead that I'm taking pictures of these things? And at that very moment, I came upon the fallen grave of a man named Timothy Judge. And so that sort of spoke to me, because I'm a man named Timothy. And I had to judge whether I was doing the right thing or not.
Yeah, and it is weird how some people feel kind of, I guess, a guilt maybe of, enjoying the cemetery and wondering if it's okay. And I've even had a few people who have seen my photos or whatever, and they've even sent me a message and they're like, okay, now I want to go out and start taking some photography in cemeteries, but is that okay? And what are the rules? And is it okay that I'm walking through? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, of course it's an opinion, but of course, well, I would love as if I was buried in one of those old beautiful cemeteries or any cemetery for someone to float through and pay me a visit and enjoy the beauty or even just the fact that you're perceiving it all as beauty. To me, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. I see your point. I suppose if there were people there burying someone and grieving, I would certainly back off. I would avoid that situation. But yeah, I think you're right. You're not really honoring the dead by taking these photographs, but you are, reminding people of our mortality, training us to see beauty in things that otherwise we may not take a look at. So yeah, I think there's certainly good that comes from it.
Absolutely. And I'm going to have to talk to the state of Missouri about getting those cemetery signs with arrows, because how much easier would that make life?
Yeah.
I've never heard of that. That's awesome.
Yeah. We've found some really interesting. We found an old cemetery of a German immigrant colony at one point. So all the names are in German and things, and it was gorgeous, and there's a bit of history. I had no idea that there was a colony of German immigrants, settling in Oklahoma, probably speaking German to one another, and it was right across from a pasture, from a bunch of cows. It was gorgeous. It was just it was so much America, so much mid-America too.
So let's review here, because I know that listeners are going to be searching for this book. So give us the information again about the book and when and where we can find that. And I'll throw all of this information in the show notes at bigseance.com.
All right. The book that will be coming out hopefully by the end of the year, if everything goes according to schedule, is called Help for the Haunted: A Decade of Vera Van Slyke Ghostly Mysteries. It's being published by Emby Press. That is EMBY Press. And probably the best place to go to find out as it develops and when it's available is my blog, which is Tim Prasil, all one word. Prasil looks like Brazil, but it's with a P, TIM, prasil.wordpress.com. Or maybe just do a Google search for Tim Prasil. I think I'm
that works.
One of two in the United States. And that's probably the best way to find it. I have started, in order to promote the book, I've started a new website specifically for Vera. On my general website, I do a lot of different things. I have those bibliographies that I mentioned. I've got the Finbar Kelly quips and limericks. But there's now a new website that's just about Vera Van Slyke. But you can find the link on my Tim Prasil web blog site.
And social media is a good way to follow you too. Do you want to give us those?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I would say just do a search for Tim Prasil, and chances are you'll find me. Or, again, I have links on my main blog page.
And I'll put those up too.
Yeah. Be very happy to have people following me, even if you just want to see what I'm up to.
Well, Tim Prasil, I want to thank you for talking with me today. You've got some fascinating things going on, and I can't wait to keep following along.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Seance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.